The year is 2017. Following the gradual decline of the collection, exploration-based mascot platformer in the wake of the rising, more modern third-person action game, your favorite genre that has regrettably laid dormant for the better part of a decade is suddenly on the brink of a widespread resurgence. Just as Nintendo is gearing up to reset the tone of their entire platform with their unattainable ambition, seasoned, tested developers have independently come together to recapture the essence of your childhood in a new game, while fresh developers are set to debut their own experiences entrenched in their childhood passion. In an effort to fill a widening gap in the market, the works of these teams have suddenly and surprisingly converged all in the same year, potentially sparking a renaissance with revitalized interest in a promising future for 3D platforming. Years later, however, that initial spark hasn't exactly triggered a movement to the degree you imagined it could. While these games largely achieved what they set out to do to great individual success, they didn't exactly mark a return to the height of the 3D platformer's popularity. And so you begin to wonder, is this it? While a few new remake collections come and go, failing to transition their successes into a real sense of momentum with new experiences that push beyond the confines of captured nostalgia. You wonder if this style of game is just too tricky, inaccessible, or risky to place a big bet on, and is therefore doomed to only see high-profile new releases when the titans of the genre, with all the resources and brand loyalty, continue to do what they've always done. Up until just this last year, this is how I felt, but lately, I've been thinking a lot about how the state of 3D platforming has evolved since this pivotal year, especially after just a handful of incredible games have released that have seemingly taken note of these past experiences and, in turn, demonstrate a trend towards a more exciting and, most importantly, sustainable future with many more exciting projects in the pipeline. I think I've seen the future of 3D platforming. And as a super fan with a deep desire to see the genre thrive and evolve while still preserving its enduring spirit that made me fall in love with video games, I feel obligated to prove it to you. So let me show you a bit of what I mean. To be perfectly honest, neither Yooka nor A Hat in Time hit me in the way I think I needed them to, especially considering at the times of each of their releases, I believed I was in the prime demographic to really enjoy them. My earliest memories with gaming were primarily defined by Donkey Kong 64 and its expansive worlds layered with goofy side activities and boundless charm, with obviously no regard for the intricacies or problems within its design, and an endless amount of time on my hands. The appeal was simply in setting out on an amusing adventure with my favorite characters to see what I could find. And what I discovered left a lasting impression on me. Almost a decade later was when I first began to really desire more from the genre after embedding myself in Banjo-Kazooie for the first time. With a little more experience and awareness, I was able to see how skillfully it utilized its collectibles and key landmarks to shepherd players on a guided tour of its awe-inspiring worlds, managing flow while preserving the wonder of open exploration. But after following up that playthrough with Banjo-Tooie, something didn't feel right. Expanding its worlds that were previously pretty tight and focused to often gargantuan proportions without the same adherence to the flow of exploration, Banjo-Tooie took an ambitious leap that just failed to resonate with me. It felt more directionless, tedious, and frustrating as it leaned harder into the contextual gatekeeping Donkey Kong 64 had since grown infamous for. And as a result, its side characters, minigames, and other gameplay shakeups began feeling less like fun little detours and more like chores, distracting from what I felt was the main appeal of the game. At that point, the writing was on the wall for me regarding Yooka. I think I just chose to ignore it, as I found myself swept up in the hype of a grand return to form. Yooka was, more or less, the sequel to Banjo-Tooie, receiving much criticism for suffering from some of the same issues its spiritual predecessors did 20 years prior. In fact, the initial reception was so negative to mixed that In spite of my own anticipation, I ended up skipping over it completely. And after finally playing it for myself, I can say this was probably for the best. A more ignorant version of myself would have been hung up on its rough exterior, reflecting the smaller budget of an ambitious, self-published indie project without realizing that the true crux of my issues were with its fundamental direction. In its entirety, the world design matched the scale of Banjo-Tooie, equally large and somewhat confusing to navigate. But it sought to differentiate itself with a compromise, aiming to appeal to fans of both styles of Banjo by putting the onus on the player to decide if they wanted to explore a tighter, introductory version of a level or expand it to its full scale. Polish issues aside, and in pursuit of pure exploration and simple task completion, this twist was an innovative and effective solution to the problem, meeting the needs of the project and its dedicated fans. But for the masses, it failed to meet expectations. And I think that's because the other half of the fundamental design failed to evolve with the times. In terms of character control, it simply did not surpass what Rare pioneered in 1998, and at times even felt like a step back. And as for me, in 2017, I was simply after something else. I just didn't quite know it yet. While A Hat in Time fared much better overall, potentially due to its tighter scope and lower expectations, I felt as though its roots in the past were still getting in the way of what I really wanted from it. It featured a simple yet satisfying movement system that was floaty and forgiving enough for new players, with a few extra wrinkles for those with more experience to grasp. But in pursuit of variety and charm, there were significant stretches of the game where this element wasn't able to shine its brightest. It wasn't until Chapter 4, Alpine Skyline, did this really click with me though. The episodic, scenario-based structure of the previous chapters was temporarily abandoned to allow the player to roam freely through a large open zone with extensive platforming challenges branching off in all different directions. And it was an absolute joy to play through, as I was finally able to explore the limits of my knowledge and skill with Hat Kid's moveset. That is, until I was roadblocked, as I did not have enough yarn to craft the right hat in order to proceed. I just used it to craft another. This honestly felt like a bit of a gut punch, and I wasn't about to go on a wild goose chase through past chapters in search of more yarn to progress in the one zone that brought me the most joy. And so at the peak of my enjoyment, I abandoned the game, wondering if there was something more to this feeling, or if I had simply outgrown my desire for this kind of experience. But then, Super Mario Odyssey blew the lid on all of these feelings wide open by bringing Mario back in a big way. While he obviously never left, Nintendo was careful to communicate where in the past they were looking for inspiration, and as a result, I did too. In the lead up to Odyssey's release, I went on my own journey replaying every 3D Mario entry just to find a way to release some of my excitement. But what I discovered along the way redefined my outlook towards the entire genre. I was pleasantly surprised by Super Mario 64, and revisiting Sunshine, my personal favorite at the time in spite of its many imperfections, was an absolute treat. But I honestly really struggled with everything that followed, whether it was in adherence to the incredible new gravity angle, or simply to prioritize ease of access to Mario's trademark, top-of-the-line level design. I felt unexpectedly dissatisfied with what the Galaxy games in particular were allowing me to do. I just couldn't move with the same fluidity and opportunities as before, prompting a bit of reflection. I loved these games when they were first released, as their new ideas offered me something I had never experienced before. But this time around, I found myself enjoying their odd, motion-based shakeups more than the core gameplay itself. My problem was not exactly with their direction. It was more in how I was choosing to reapproach them. It was like riding the same thrill ride again and again. Still a wonderfully polished and inventive experience, but also one with exceedingly diminishing returns. On the other hand, Super Mario 64 was always in the background of my childhood, never commanding my full attention until now, as I began to more thoroughly explore the full range of its movement possibilities and how often they could be used to circumvent the open sandbox nature of its level design. It seemingly pulled back the veil of charm and immersion my childhood favorites used to captivate me in order to focus purely on the feel of the game, the sense of inertia and momentum, the windows of opportunity allowing the player to make quick adaptations, and the exhausting flowchart of maneuvers made possible by chaining different moves together in countless ways. It was purely, utterly addictive. But admittedly, it was also somewhat unintuitive. Super Mario 64 was the first of its kind, after all, and so in order to control it with the utmost precision, I had to rid myself of certain behaviors learned after the genre became more standardized, while picking up on many of its nuances that were too minor to explicitly explain to the player, but were required to understand in order to feel truly comfortable with its movement. And this left Super Mario Odyssey with an incredible opportunity. By refining the fundamental movement to better reflect the advancements in character control made over the last 2 decades and combining it with all the new and unusual mechanics offered by the cap, the best elements of both Super Mario 64 and Sunshine were suddenly brought together in the ultimate sandbox platforming adventure. With its transformations, new ideas could be contextually introduced to freshen up the moment-to-moment play without gating the fun behind more missing collectibles or unlockable moves. Its level design, while vastly exceeding the scale of any Mario game to precede it, still managed to maintain flow by minimizing interruptions and prioritizing smaller rewards, sprinkling hundreds of collectibles between its many landmarks and platforming excursions. But most importantly, the real reason I found myself unable to put the game down even during its duller moments was because the fundamental movement felt like a game in and of itself. The way Mario could build incredible momentum rolling down a hill before flinging out his arms like he did in the classics. How the cap felt like a natural extension of all of Mario's existing abilities with endless possibilities, promoting an unparalleled sense of flow. And how the level design responded to my creativity with small nods of affirmation. There were so many new techniques to discover, but their nuances never got in the way of simply enjoying the game. It was so wonderfully executed that an excellent experience awaited any type of player, while I could dig deeper into its essence of fluidity, freedom, and expression that no other video game genre could provide me. Not even my favorite 2D platformers, at least not to the same extent. This was it. This was the watershed moment I was hoping for. Just as Super Mario 64 set the tone of the genre as a 3D platforming pioneer driving the production of countless imitators with their own interesting ideas, Odyssey brought the Mario I had suddenly become obsessed with back to the forefront of Nintendo's portfolio and into the hands of tens of millions of players, introducing them to the unique joys of not only tight and responsive control, but fluid movement, allowing them to express their skill and creativity. This was the foundation 3D platforming needed for a true revitalization, except the imitators did not follow. In reality, the gaming climate of 2017 proved to be far different than that of 1996, where a single large studio was able to pump out a deluge of new releases year after year. Those hundreds of staff members that could work concurrently in small teams across multiple projects were now led to focus on just one, with a far greater scope to meet the demands of the ballooning AAA market. Super Mario Odyssey's own scope was likely an adaptation to the current demand for open-world games, as many likened its approach to a natural evolution of the Collect-a-thon craze of the late 90s, which also made replicating its success far riskier and challenging. It would also take more time. And so, the following year saw the genre as a whole dipping back into old habits, with just a handful of breakthrough new releases among other remakes and collections, as the path forward became foggy once again. But beginning in 2021, I think this began to change in a big way. In a year shaping up to be another unicorn period for 3D platforming with the release of the long-awaited Psychonauts 2, a new Ratchet & Clank, and the explosion of It Takes Two taking Game of the Year, what excited me the most wasn't any of these individual releases, but a new prospect of longevity. Because if 3D platforming was too representative of the past, risky, or niche for more AAA publishers to make a big bet on, and the essence of Super Mario Odyssey's appeal was too ambitious for just anyone to recapture, the job would have to fall where passion often burns its brightest: independent development. They just needed a more feasible example to follow. And I think Bowser's Fury paved the way by demonstrating the appeal of density over vastness. With just a single, large sandbox zone to focus on, its developers were able to address criticism by greatly reducing its volume of collectibles while packing Lake Lapcat with extensive platforming challenges some argued were spread too thinly in Odyssey. And with an effective and fun new means of traversal between each of its islands, Bowser's Fury was able to blend much of the essence of Mario's tighter sandbox adventures of the past with the seamless brilliance of this new age of Mario. But for me, there was just one thing missing. While Bowser's Fury controls great, relying on its array of stored and contextual power-ups to spice up play and provide its own means of expression, the core movement was still somewhat limited by its tethering to Super Mario 3D World. It certainly didn't match or surpass Odyssey, and so as a minor 3 to 6 hour side excursion tacked onto a port of 3D World to Nintendo, I think Bowser's Fury was likely little more than an experiment meant to tease what could be next for Mario. But for an indie developer, I think the recipe for the next breakout success was left on the table, and ever since, new games have come closer and closer to fully capturing this. In 2023, a year stacked with stellar indie releases, the unassuming product of a game jam with a 5-month total development period managed to shatter its own creators' expectations, resulting in life-changing success. Pseudoregalia, a 3D Metroidvania platformer with 90s Castlevania stylings, wasn't remotely on my radar until a friend's recommendation made it clear how seemingly tailor-made it was for me. As platforming in 3D gradually declined over time, so too did the platforming-heavy 3D Metroidvania, as the essence of its exploration and level design was more commonly absorbed by other genres rising in popularity. And this left a hole in the market few developers were bold enough to fill. Metroidvanias by design can be so tricky to navigate that some frustration and misdirection is almost expected. And with a new dimension of complexity, this feeling can prove to be uniquely overwhelming in 3D. Just one of many reasons why the genre as a whole dipped back into a comfortable 2D niche as independent development became more accessible and largely revived the entire genre. But as far as I'm concerned, Pseudoregalia managed to avoid so much potential frustration by recognizing and embracing the limitations of its scope and design while allowing its incredibly fluid and expressive movement to carry the experience. While it starts out slow with a very limited moveset, as is often customary for the genre, it isn't long before just a few key upgrades come together to complete a core moveset matching the brilliance of some of the best movement-heavy platformers out there, because each of its abilities chain together seamlessly and offer additional, game-changing functionality that is often left up to the player to discover for themselves. It resulted in the same feeling I experienced playing Super Mario Odyssey, where feeling completely lost in this case was such a negligible issue because the game did everything in its power to keep me moving and finding new ways to overcome past challenges effortlessly, and as such, is one of few Metroidvanias I found even more compelling in the second playthrough. Earlier this year, another studio led by the creative minds behind Sonic Mania showed what a simple yet fluid and expressive movement system could provide a more linear experience with Penny's Big Breakaway. Compared to Pseudoregalia, there's really just a handful of moves prioritizing Penny's yo-yo, but rather than feeling like an extension of the fundamental expressive playstyle introduced by Mario, where the former would find much of its inspiration, Penny's offered something that felt entirely new and fun by appealing directly to the more extrinsically motivated player and even harkening back to Sonic's 3D adventures of old. While the first layer of gameplay simply involves getting to grips with its unconventional moveset, where the importance of a few of its components isn't immediately conveyed, I found myself stretching my capabilities in pursuit of the elusive endless combo before I'd even completed my first playthrough. In fact, with its uniquely twin-stick method of control and emphasis on building combos to maximize score, Penny's Big Breakaway felt like a platforming analog to an entirely different kind of experience, best represented by the Tony Hawk Pro Skater games, or better yet, the Skate series, with its revolutionary Flick It control system. After quickly coming to this realization, I began to more deeply study its moveset in order to maintain enough speed and momentum to keep my combo alive as long as possible, channeling a rollout at the apex of the yo-yo's reach for maximum acceleration, timing swings with precision to lurch forward or get just enough height to grab an out-of-reach platform, and buffering spins in place of a manual. While Sonic has struggled to nurture a consistently positive reception to his start and stop boost playstyle that can often feel more like it's testing Twitch reflexes and memory rather than a deep understanding of the character's movement, Penny's Big Breakaway tapped into and built heavily upon the type of playstyle that fostered my attachment to Sonic. One with a little more freedom that incentivizes mastery with a ranking system demanding exceedingly flashy combos to perfect. However, the real reason I find myself bursting with excitement for the future is because out of seemingly nowhere, the developer of one of my most anticipated games released what is effectively a tease of an exceedingly ambitious project evoking exactly what I've been dreaming for since I first played Bowser's Fury. I actually just previously discussed my anticipation of The Big Catch, a game all about exploring how the essence of fishing could be applied to a tight, fast, and exploration-focused 3D platformer. And little did I know that just a few months later, I would be playing it in the form of the Big Catch Tackle Box, a standalone prologue to the full game meant to demonstrate a fraction of what it is attempting to achieve. A fraction with shockingly so much content in such a strong direction that it could easily be mistaken for a full game. In just minutes following a brief tutorial zone, the tackle box unleashes the player into a vast desert littered with structures housing platforming challenges that are seemingly meant to stress test many of the unique mechanics the Big Catch is attempting to offer in its full release. Some are pretty short and straight to the point, while still pushing the limits of the game's physics, while others are true gauntlets with branching paths, matching the scale of what could be a full level in a more straightforward course clear game. And there's a great deal of excitement in seeing these massive structures looming over the horizon, wondering what unique challenges and ideas they have waiting in store as you surf across the sands in a completely seamless world. There's not a loading screen in sight. But as can often be the case with demos of this nature, I think there's also reason to feel some concern and uncertainty. The tackle box is difficult and unforgiving by design. The movement is tight, but uniquely demanding, feeling much like the antithesis to what a Hat in Time presented. Tackle is heavy, and honestly can't jump very high on his own, which is where all these context-sensitive interactions utilizing both parkour elements and his fishing rod come into play, frequently granting him incredible bursts of speed that the camera can struggle to keep up with, as some of the more precise landings end up feeling like unreasonable leaps of faith. And due to the seamless nature of the game, the punishment for failure is most commonly another trek through a platforming sequence you've already completed countless times just to get another shot at the one jump giving you the most trouble. It can feel pretty tedious pretty frequently, and this is coming from a casual speedrunner with a lot of experience and repetition. With Filet Group's approach of releasing the tackle box for free while keeping communication to a minimum and simply absorbing any and all feedback, it's honestly difficult to predict how these elements and concerns will be addressed in the final game. It's possible a smoother difficulty curve and some final tweaks to movement will ease any qualms I have with the current skill floor. But even if it doesn't end up exactly how I envision it, my excitement hasn't decreased in the slightest. In fact, it's only since expanded, because to me, this bold direction, the interest and passion behind it, and the confidence to simply put a skeletal version of the final product in as many hands as possible indicates there's something more to this timely shift in 3D platformer design. While these games are all attempting to achieve their own distinct goals, they also have something incredibly important in common. By exploring a deeper range of interactions between movement and level design, and embracing player agency, they're unafraid of truly innovating to a degree I believe most AAA publishers are unwilling to attempt. I'll probably draw some heat for this, but I'm prepared for it. Look no further than Sonic himself. Through all his many gimmicks and evolutions, so often is there this tangible hesitancy to explore the full possibilities of whichever new concept Sonic Team wishes to introduce. Whether it's the modern boost style, Lost World with its unique parkour system and galaxy-like level design, or even the latest entry in the series. At some point, these games always end up relying on 2D sections because they're easier to predict and engage with. Even Sonic Frontiers, a game that strives to emulate the Sandbox experience Nintendo has since popularized, still leans heavily on the linear, scripted sequences the series has always relied on, because they cover a reluctance to relinquish full control to the player with forced variety. They're so afraid of dropping the guardrails and crafting an experience where the player is in full control with the full freedom to fulfill a playstyle that best matches their skill set, because that design philosophy is inherently riskier and unpredictable. And you know what? That's fine, because in spite of my own desire to see Sonic become the poster child of this movement, embodying the essence of his character, I understand that his primary purpose is to appeal to as wide an audience as possible. But I don't believe that's how a genre can sustain itself or grow. I do believe these games, on the other hand, disrupt that line of thinking, and instead of prioritizing audience capture, are embracing the limitless possibilities of 3D while facing their unique challenges head-on. And that means not all will be successful or appeal to as wide an audience as Mario or Sonic, or even projects like Yooka, Laylee, and A Hat in Time that sought to fill a very specific need at an opportune moment. It may sound as though I'm dismissing or diminishing the desire for the simpler, more accessible experiences I once grew up with, the same types of games that cultivated the passion and attachment that brought me here today. But what I'm really trying to say is that this kind of experience brings with it a much needed sense of diversity and health to the genre, because they're fulfilling a role only they are willing to fill, one that plays specifically into the strengths of indie development. While Pseudoregalia, Penny's Big Breakaway, and The Big Catch wear their inspirations just as plainly, their ambitions extend well beyond the shadows of what came before them. By offering all types of players a new and refined sense of agency, they are the legacy of over 2 decades of institutional knowledge following the birth of the genre, and in that way, feel more akin to experiencing what these games sought to offer when we first played them, bringing with them much greater risk. After all, true innovation is certainly not always pristine or well executed. However, I think now more than ever is there reason to be confident in this approach, as a trend is beginning to form. This isn't a flash in the pan. This is a shift in philosophy, and these are just a handful of the many games that currently demonstrate the potential of what is yet to come. While indie projects cannot reasonably emulate the scale of hugely successful titles like Super Mario Odyssey, they can adopt its fundamental design philosophy, an approach that allows players to feel as if they are applying paint to a canvas rather than finding a specific key to fit a lock. There is a special kind of value embedded in this direction that contrasts so wonderfully with current industry trends we are so tired of facing, the kind of alluring essence that draws you back into a game not to engage with new content, but to re-experience it in a new way. And with many more projects on the way, seeking to evoke the same kind of feeling, I really think this is just the beginning of a much greater shift than anything felt in recent years. It's so foundational, we can even put a name to it. This is the expression revolution. Thank you so much for watching, and I want to extend a big thank you to my Patreon supporters for funding videos like this, including Julian Messmer, Questing Refuge, and Blacktooth Bob. I'm always on the hunt for new and interesting games, so please let me know if I've missed anything embodying this philosophy in the comments below. And consider subscribing if you're interested in more indie games like these. Thanks again, and I hope to see you again very soon.